Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Luffy advanced to Conqueror Haki, part 1. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I do not own this fanfic, and also make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, The Lost Samurai, and support him for writing this awesome fanfic. Link is in the description. Let's begin this story. Straw Hat Luffy was awakened by a subtle swing that seemed to grow more violent by the second, as he opened his eyes, blinked, and yawned tiredly. What was he doing before he dozed off? Memories presented themselves as his mind snapped back into alertness. Oh, yeah. He was still drifting. What was that noise? He took a look around him as his eyes focused, and laughed out loud. Damn, how do I always forget these things? He asked with obvious mirth in the face of the whirlpool that threatened to devour his inadequacy of a boat. In the long run, something like this was trivial, laughable really, but Luffy couldn't help but find it troubling that it could have potentially ended his journey before it had even begun. He glanced at the barrel next to him as it rocked back and forth with the waves. Should he try it? It should work based on past experience. He quickly dismissed the thought, though, chastising himself for his careless nature. If it didn't work, he wasn't coming out of the water unless a miracle happened. In his experience, miracles happened often, although they could only help you so much. Regardless, he didn't want to risk it. It would not do for the future Pirate King to die at the hands of a tiny-ass whirlpool like this. It wasn't his own fate he was worried about as much as the fate of the lives he would come to affect. In the beginning of his journey, he had easily resigned himself to the risks of his foolish dream, but as thoughts of those that he had to protect gradually piled up on his conscience, that meant it became increasingly difficult to maintain. In the eyes of many, he would always be a careless idiot, and in some respects this would always hold true. But what some didn't realize was that there were some things he had an ingrained intelligence for from the beginning, and other things he had forcefully willed himself to learn along the way with some help. He made a quick decision. He had already resolved to play an active role this time around, and that meant not leaving himself at the mercy of a barrel if he could help it. So he took a quick leap off the boat, propelling himself over the waters with a force that almost sank it. Any sane person would have wondered if he was losing it with this recent action, but sane people didn't last very long where he was going. After reaching the highest point of his jump, he took another step, and the air below him responded in turn, propelling him higher and further. He took more steps until he was cruising through the air at a comfortable speed. Now, to get down to business. This should be classy. He reached out with his observation haki, and more than a few dozen weak auras flickered to life within range of his senses. He also sensed slightly stronger auras approaching them. He predicted that they were all on a collision course, but then again he already knew that. It was an ambush after all. He accelerated quickly, and made his way over to the slightly stronger auras in the distance. One in particular dwarfed them all in power, but in other aspects that were far more important at this stage, it paled in comparison to another that Luffy instantly recognized. The shockingly humble presence brought a nostalgic smile to Luffy's face. Wait for me, old buddy. He reached the pirate ship with the Jolly Roger that confirmed Luffy's already solid guess, and touched down after quickly decelerating. The two pirates that were guarding the deck looked at him in shock, but shock quickly turned to malice. If they gave any more thought to the fact that they hadn't even noticed his approach until he had landed right in front of them, they may have been a bit more cautious. As it was, they were inclined to ask who the hell he was, and charge at him with swords at the ready before waiting for an answer. Luffy was in deep thought, but spared them a glance as he punched both their lights out. Leaving the unconscious fodder on the deck, he made his way through a door, and caught sight of the person who he had come to find. At first glance of the bright pink hair and pudgy appearance, he had to resist the urge to laugh out loud. He compared this timid boy to the quiet confident Marine he would one day grow up to be. There were some similarities other than appearance, most notably in his aura, but it was nonetheless difficult. The boy was being relentlessly harassed by a small group of pirates who were too busy taunting him to even notice Luffy's approach. Excited yet, Kobe? This is gonna be a big haul. Are you looking forward to some good old-fashioned pirating? The boy weakly glared at him, causing him to laugh. The others followed suit. Is it even a question? One thug asked. Here's a better one. Are you looking forward to hiding below deck like a little bitch, and then cleaning the captain's shoes just to avoid a beating? They all howled with laughter. Cody turned red before he, to Luffy's disappointment, looked at the ground, and let out a resigned sigh. We'll have to work on that, Luffy thought, as he mentally willed Kobe to drop-kick their asses through the floor, knowing full well that he wasn't capable of it. Yet, as he stepped in front of Kobe, the unobservant idiots who by all rights should have been dead by now, mercy was not common on the vast seas, even if a minority of pirates made a habit of exercising it, finally took notice of his presence. Who the hell is this guy? I've never seen him before, one said suspiciously. New recruit maybe? Another piped up. The one who had been taunting immediately before Luffy stopped and glared at him. Who are you? Identify yourself. Luffy looked him dead in the eye, and grinned. Well, I'm the guy who defeated your crew, kicked your captain's ass, and sunk your ship. That's all you really need to know. The pirates gaped at his audacity, but hesitated to attack. Something about this guy was holding them back, but they weren't smart enough for it to last very long. Luffy scratched his head at his own phrasing. To them, he was simply speaking from a future perspective, but it was technically true, minus sinking the ship. He had left that to the Marines last time. Before they could charge, Luffy spoke. You'll wake up in about 10 minutes. Try not to drown, I guess. This stopped them in their tracks as they stared in confusion upon hearing the cryptic statement. Then they dropped to the ground, foaming at the mouth. Luffy observed Kobe carefully. The blast, although weak to the point where he had to consciously control himself, was directed at everyone in the room. Kobe was kneeling on the floor, sweating profusely and panting for breath, but he was still conscious. Not bad. Luffy smiled to himself, realizing that even this crybaby Kobe, who had zero confidence, and next to zero mental discipline, was still much stronger-willed than your average East Blue pirate. That wasn't saying much, but it was something. Hey, you're Kobe, aren't you? If I heard right anyway, mind giving me some food? I'm starving. Kobe was scared shitless at being addressed so casually by the person who had quite literally brought him to his knees with use of a faceless, overwhelming power. He nodded weakly, and stood up on trembling knees. He walked forward, refusing to stumble, and led the mysterious boy to a supply storage closet, if only to appease him. He looked back at him as he walked, and gulped. The boy didn't seem to be hostile to him despite the display earlier. If anything, he should thank him for saving him from a potential beating. He was too intimidated at the moment to think of the ramifications of what the boy had just done. If those pirates were waking up in 10 minutes, they would surely run to Alvida, and the thought would have sickened him, if he had been in a state of mind to worry about it. Instead, he opened the door, and let the boy walk into the storage closet, as if his life depended on it. Wow, thanks Kobe. He dove into a barrel full of apples, and started inhaling them. That was the only description Kobe could really use. If he was chewing at all, Kobe couldn't see it. It was all a blur as he bounced from one side of the room to another, and gradually emptied the supply closet of his precious food. Just when Kobe was starting to wonder where on earth he put it all, the boy stopped, sighing as he visibly restrained himself, and patted his stomach dispassionately. It's not much, but it will hold me over. I should leave some room for meat. Kobe looked at him dubiously, and found the courage to speak for the first time since the boy's introduction. How much can you eat? Are you a glutton? The boy looked at him, and Kobe froze, wondering if the slip had been a mistake. To his relief, the boy just laughed. Most would say I am, he admitted. I have room for a lot more, but food doesn't do much for me. My body is weird. I need some meat, but this will be enough until I make it to the next island. I might have to stock up here, though. I haven't eaten in over a day. Kobe frowned as he interpreted stock up to mean steal. He squashed the rising disapproval. This ship was filled with ruthless pirates, and as ashamed as he was to admit it, he was one of them. He had no right to look down on someone who stole from scum. Why have you gone so long without eating? Kobe asked. The boy just shrugged. A day isn't really that long, he answered. Normally he would be dismayed at the prospect of not eating for that long, but at the moment his thoughts were wandering to a certain man he would meet up with on the island he was visiting next. But since you asked, I was at sea, and quickly ran out of food, since I had no idea where I was going until I finally spotted this ship. That surprised Kobe. He should have guessed that the boy was a sailor, but the more sane part of his mind assumed he had somehow snuck aboard from the civilian ship that Alvida was about to purge. He remembered suddenly that a conflict would begin soon, and settled for one last question. If you don't mind me asking, what was that thing you did back there? You knocked those guys out cold without lifting a finger. The boy smirked. Sorry. That's a secret. But you'll find out one day. Again with the vague responses. Kobe nodded despite his lingering curiosity. Meanwhile, Luffy was internally wondering if he should just tell him. He didn't really feel like explaining the concept of Conqueror's Haki to someone who had yet to truly see the world. Even a small glimpse of its vastness might discourage the boy from pursuing his dream at this point. Oops, he said suddenly. I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry. He stood up, and Kobe nodded to convey his desire to know. He smiled widely, and threw his hands up in the air. I'm Monkey D. Luffy. The man who is going to become the Pirate King. Kobe's jaw hung loosely in response to the bold statement. Pirate King? Do you even realize what that means? He asked in shock. Yes, Luffy said simply. But Kobe shook his head furiously. You're insane. Your desire is to stand at the top of this great age of pirates. A hint of fear crept itself into Kobe's voice at the thought of the boy he had unwittingly started to like dying a gruesome death. Don't tell me you're going to the Grand Line. Are you after One Piece? The boy nodded, confirming his suspicion. Kobe continued shaking his head. It's impossible, Luffy. Give up now before you get yourself killed. I know I just met you, and have no right to order you around, but I don't want you to die a premature death. Luffy held back from bonking him on the head, if only because Kobe had worked up the courage to shout at him, something he wasn't sure he would have the nerve to do after Luffy kind of overdid it by testing his will. Instead he just gave the boy a confident smirk. Not likely. It will be a while before things actually get dangerous, but I'll be ready when they do. Even so, if I die, I die. At the very least, I will leave my mark on this world. Kobe looked awed. He probably assumed that Luffy meant he was going to make a name for himself, and while that was inevitable, Luffy was thinking more along the lines of impacting the lives of his crewmates. Technically, he didn't know them yet, which felt weird, but it hadn't been difficult to come to the decision that he would recruit every one of them. Luffy was no saint, he wouldn't go out of his way to help people he didn't know if he had no direct reason to do so. But with people who he knew as his comrades, people that he knew were suffering, and had such bright potential for both goodness and greatness, there wasn't much of a decision to make. I wonder if I can be like that. Kobe's quiet voice pulled him out of his thoughts. I wonder if I can live with no doubts, confidently fulfilling my ambitions. Luffy shrugged. No reason why you can't. Kobe's fists were clenched and started shaking. I have a dream, he whispered. It's nowhere near as amazing as yours, but I wonder if I can do it. He looked up to meet the focused gaze of Luffy, who smiled widely. Only you can answer that one. But Kobe continued on, ranting as if he'd been discouraged, which Luffy thought was hilarious. No, I will do it. I will become a marine. A great marine who follows the code of justice to the end. And I will stop pirates from wreaking havoc on the innocent. Luffy's smile grew even wider. Does that include Alvida? It was a calculated risk, he knew. Kobe's eyes widened in fear before the determination flooded back into them stronger than before. He took a deep breath and shouted, I will capture Alvida. There was a sudden crash, and Kobe caught sight of a giant mace sticking out of the ruined wooden wall. I was wondering where the hell you were while the others were attacking our target. And here I find you aiding a bounty hunter, and entertaining thoughts of mutiny. Kobe stared in horror at the still smiling boy. Did he do that on purpose? Why? What would his motive be? He had essentially just gotten Kobe killed for revealing his traitorous thoughts, but that didn't mean Alvida would have mercy on him. What was he trying to do? Alvida addressed Luffy directly. And who do you think you are, planting thoughts of treason into my gullible cabin boy? Do you know who I am, brat? Luffy looked at her, bored. The biggest whale in East Blue. All doubts vanished from Kobe's mind. Luffy was definitely trying to get them both killed. Luffy's thoughts were elsewhere. Wait, does Laboon count? Nah, he's on the other side of Reverse Mountain, so that's not in East Blue. I guess there might be whales bigger than her in the eastern seas, but I've never met them, so it's not like I have any proof. So as far as I'm concerned, she's the biggest. He mentally pictured a certain orange-haired girl, commenting on the idiocy of his thought process, before he snapped back to reality, just as Alvida's shocked expression melted away to make room for an enraged one. Before she could compose herself enough to act, Luffy turned to Kobe with the same bored expression. What do you think, Kobe? I guess there might be bigger whales out there, he said. Comprehension dawned on Kobe's face. It was a test. He was to become a marine. Marines could not simply bow their heads in the face of insurmountable power. Their job was to protect the world from injustice when no one else would. How could he ever be a marine if he couldn't stand up to a single pirate? That's what it's about, isn't it, Luffy? The resolve to put your life on the line. His eyes hardened, and something shifted within him. He snapped. The fattest bitch-ass whale from here to Lodetown. Iron Mace Alvida. He shouted it at the top of his lungs. Alvida wordlessly swung at the offending stain of a child with all her might, only for him to disappear from sight along with the bounty hunter. When her perception of reality caught up with what had just happened, she recognized that there had been a crash directly above her. She looked up to see a hole in the ship's deck. The shitson of a bounty hunter was standing above deck with Kobe sprawled down beside him in shock. He was casually taking down pirates who had reacted with hostility to his sudden interruption of their pirating. As they kept coming, he seemed to get slightly annoyed, and his arms seemed to blur out of sight. As Alvida climbed out of the hole he had made, she realized that all of her henchmen were now unconscious. The rational part of her brain told her to be wary of this boy, the same part that was ruthlessly stomped into submission by the part of her brain that desperately wanted to process the image of his bloody body dead at her feet. She screamed in frustration as she jumped into the air and came crashing down behind the boy, swinging down with her mace. Kobe's eyes widened. He didn't even have time to shout a warning before the iron mace came crashing down on Luffy, and shattered upon contact with his head. Alvida started to back away as her brain registered that perhaps she wasn't a match for this boy at all. These insinuations, which were normally silenced by the part of her brain that dealt with treasonous thoughts, seemed to be roaring through her mind all of a sudden, unable to be suppressed. She continued to back away until the boy disappeared from her sight once again. A fist collided with the back of her head, robbing her of her consciousness. Kobe watched as his preconceptions of the world were shattered right before his eyes. He knew Luffy was strong from what he'd shown so far, but to defeat the pirate that had plagued his existence for so long so effortlessly it left him feeling oddly inadequate. Luffy was frowning. He had meant to demonstrate the practical use of his rubber body, but his reflexes had chosen a much more sophisticated method of defense. He was so used to fighting New World pirates. Should he even try to explain what just happened to the awestruck boy? He decided against it. Devil fruits were one thing, but he wasn't sure how he would explain something like armament haki to Kobe so early on even if he wanted to. He was no really. He sucked at explaining things. Instead, he addressed another issue. The Marines will be here soon. You can try to join them, but it would be suspicious in this situation. In fact, they might just arrest you. Kobe nodded sadly at that. It was an accurate assumption. Why don't you come with me for now? I'm going to a certain island to meet up with someone, but I honestly don't know how to get there. He laughed sheepishly while saying it. But there's a Marine base on that island. It would be a good starting place for you. Kobe smiled and nodded with enthusiasm. It was then that Luffy realized he didn't have a boat. He had abandoned his to his fate at the hands of the whirlpool. The thought saddened him. It was no going merry. It hadn't even come close to developing a consciousness from what he could tell, although admittedly he wasn't exactly an expert on the subject. Still, a pirate should look after his ship when he can. He idly considered stealing the ship he was on while avoiding the Marines, but he didn't want to risk Kobe being cited as an accomplice. And anyway, he had a threat to follow through on. He lifted his foot up above his head and brought it down in an axe kick. The effect was instantaneous. The ship's hull split right down the middle, and it began to sink. Kobe, who wasn't that surprised at this point, decided not to comment on the pointless destruction. The Marines would have sunk the ship anyway. Wondering what he was going to do now, Luffy reached out with his senses and froze. His eyes widened. How had he missed it until now? The quick scan with his observation Haki revealed who she was. For all her stealth skills, she couldn't exactly escape his sixth sense. Only someone with similar training could attempt that, and this girl had none for now. Her aura was radiating fear. That was likely a panicked reaction to what she had just seen, which, knowing her, was everything. It's good to see you again, Nami, he thought, as sadness and nostalgia welled up inside him in equal proportions. He grabbed Kobe and nonchalantly jumped off of the ship and onto her boat. Nami's eyes widened comically, and she gasped. She had been planning to get away while she still had a chance, but he had found her somehow. This guy was dangerous. Hello, the boy greeted me. Sorry for the trouble, but we're kind of stranded. Would you mind giving us a ride to Shellstown? We have some business there. Nami calmly assessed the situation. She knew Shellstown was on the same island as the 153rd Marine Branch. She was planning to go there herself to investigate a lead she had acquired. Perhaps it would be best to take this guy there to appease him long enough to get out of danger. He just single-handedly defeated a notorious pirate crew and trashed their ship. She had taken down one of Alvida's cronies herself, but only because she'd been spotted. She would never attempt something so outrageous and stupid. She wondered if this guy was a pirate, but decided against asking. She simply nodded in response to his request. The obvious signs of fear Nami was showing saddened Luffy. Her faith in him had never faltered even a bit after the events of Arlong Park, so this was kind of difficult for him to digest. He didn't want Nami helping him out of fear, but he needed to meet up with his other crewmate as soon as possible. Gaining Nami's complete loyalty was a bitch the first time around, and he didn't blame her, but he wasn't at all deterred. He resolved to turn this fear into a deeply ingrained trust, and not just in him. He owed her that much. Keeping the hurt off his face, he flashed her a smile and thanked her. This was his second chance. A new beginning. Bring it on. As her ship sailed towards Shellstown with the two unexpected passengers, Nami was desperately trying, for the sake of her own safety, not to comment on the stupidity of a person actually trying to navigate the sea without a map, compass, or general sense of direction. But as Luffy casually estimated the chances that he would have made it to the island on his own without dying of hunger or thirst, and washing up on shore as a corpse, and his estimation was very low, Nami couldn't contain her sentiments anymore. While Kobe was sweating in exasperation, she abruptly turned to him with a scowl on his face. That's not something to laugh about, you dumbass, she screamed. Luffy stopped laughing and looked at her. Nami recoiled and covered her mouth with her hands. Crap, she thought as Luffy stared at her for a few seconds. Then the strangest thing happened. A fond smile broke out across his face, and then he chuckled. No, I guess it's not, he said. Nami recovered, confused. Had she completely misread him? So far since they set out he hadn't made any move that could be considered hostile. He had just been chatting amiably with Kobe the entire time. The only time the two of them had interacted was for introductions. When asked her name, Nami replied that it was Nichiko. Luffy nodded and accepted this without further question, and Nami concluded that he was a bit dense, which was good to know. There was no point giving him any information that he could potentially use to find her, and the chances he'd ever set foot on her home island were slim, so the name she had picked was irrelevant. But now she wondered if she had simply misjudged him. Sure, he was unnaturally strong. In fact, she was pretty sure she'd seen her do a couple things that were 100% impossible, but it was hard to see from that angle. But strong people didn't necessarily have to abuse their strength, even if most did. She concluded from this that he wasn't a pirate at least, but she still had to be cautious around him. Nevertheless, she was now comfortable enough to ask some simple questions. Luffy. He turned to her. Hey, what's up? He replied. Why are you heading to Shelltown? What business do you have there? She wouldn't tell him that she herself was going to steal a map of the Grand Line, of course. That was something he really didn't need to know. Luffy smiled brightly at the question. Oh, I'm meeting up with a friend. Maybe you've heard of him. His name is Zoro. Two sets of eyes widened at this new information. As in Kobe started to ask but trailed off. Nami recognized the name too. It wasn't exactly common. Urano Zoro. He's known as the Pirate Hunter, Luffy confirmed. Kobe broke into a cold sweat. He's a friend of yours, Luffy. Luffy nodded to him. The thought of the Pirate Hunter having friends sounded very far-fetched to him. Nami was thinking the same thing, but now she was also wondering if he was a bounty hunter. That would explain his strength, but then why didn't he turn in Alvida's bounty? Was it not high enough for his tastes? Nami started to frown at the raw stupidity of that notion, while Kobe silently wondered how someone who was aiming to be Pirate King had ever ended up friends with the most infamous bounty hunter in East Blue. That just sounded like a betrayal waiting to happen. When they finally arrived on the island, Luffy locked onto Zoro's oar. It was easily the most profound presence on the island, towering above the others like a god amongst men. Was Zoro even trying to suppress it? Probably not, he decided. There were no other Haki users in East Blue, so this was basically a giant fluorescent beacon signaling for Luffy to come find him. He frowned for a second. Were they really the only ones? His thoughts drifted momentarily to Smokey. Luffy was pretty sure his marine rival had awakened both types of Haki by the time of Marineford, even if he couldn't utilize them very well. He had done the same even if he didn't realize it, starting with Conqueror's Haki in Sabati, and Amazon Lily, Armament Haki in Impel Down, and finally observing Haki in Marineford. He found it interesting that they manifested in the order of his eventual proficiency with each of them. But he couldn't exactly tell when Haki users had awakened the ability if they had achieved it before him. On the way to the bar he listened in on some conversations as he walked down the street, gathering information on recent events, one of which seemed to be the topic of almost every conversation he eavesdropped on. He pretty much knew what happened from the moment he sensed Zoro in a civilian environment rather than the marine base, but what he heard confirmed his suspicions. Zoro had managed, or more accurately, decided, to escape from the Marines, and raise hell in the base, plowing through unfortunate Marine soldiers with his sword sheath, and finally knocking an enraged Marine Captain Morgan out cold. The entire town had been stunned by the news. This marked the end of Morgan's reign of tyranny, and it had happened so fast. While the Marines were grateful, they were also slightly disconcerted at the level of strength he had so casually displayed, as if he had just been putting up with their crap the entire time. Luffy knew that in reality he couldn't have escaped from the beginning, but Morgan's fate had been sealed the moment Zoro's mind had been flooded with the memories of his future self. When they asked him what he intended to do while in the town, Zoro had replied that he was waiting for a certain man to arrive, and couldn't leave until then. It seems Zoro caused quite the ruckus here, Luffy said smugly. Kobe and Nami had taken to following him silently, and now looked at him with confused expressions. Luffy continued. Apparently Marine Captain Morgan, who was in charge of the Marine base here, was abusing his rank to oppress the townspeople. Kobe looked baffled and somewhat angry, while Nami just narrowed her eyes, not really surprised. His idiot son, Helmeppo or something like that, also used his influence to gain special privileges, and when Zoro put him in his place for harassing the townspeople, he threatened to start executing them. Zoro agreed to be locked up for a month in the Marine base without food to avoid having civilian deaths on his conscience, but Helmeppo never intended to let him go. When he found out that they were planning on executing him anyway, he escaped and beat the crap out of Captain Morgan. The Marines decided to apprehend Morgan right then and there. Kobe looked outraged now. Luffy didn't really want to destroy the kid's admiration of the Marines, but the sooner he came to terms with reality, the better. Luffy knew he wouldn't end up following that absolute justice crap, but it was better that he understood what kind of organization he would be working for sooner rather than later. Nami turned to him with curious eyes. How do you know all that anyway? Luffy scratched his head. It's a skill that I've picked up on. I listen to fragments of conversations while walking through crowds to try to gather a full picture of what's going on in the area. It's pretty useful. Nami nodded, wondering if she should try to learn how to do that. Kobe was impressed. That's amazing, Luffy. Where'd you learn how to do that? Luffy put on a sad smile. A friend taught me how. A long time ago Nami and Kobe decided not to push for more information after that. Luffy sighed. While his proficiency with the skill was naturally much higher with the use of observation Haki, Robin had it down to an art form. She was capable of flawlessly picking up on information as she walked innocently through the streets without the aid of anything other than her eyes and ears. Luffy was no Enel. He couldn't pick up on conversations from a mile away, an ability that he attributed to the self-proclaimed god's devil fruit, but gathering information while he walked down the street, while not an ingrained habit like with Robin, was child's play if he just paid attention. When they arrived at the bar that the aura was pulsating from, Luffy absently noted that Zoro had sensed his presence as well. His aura was flaring with excitement, even if he'd never show it for the world to see. Luffy walked in, followed closely by his two traveling companions. He stopped behind the bench on which the subject of his search was seated, and the bartender, a woman with brown hair and eyes, looked at him with a nervous smile. A little girl that Luffy knew as Rika stared at him in wonder from behind the counter. Yo, Zoro, he said casually, with a hint of amusement. The green-haired man took a long swig of his sake, and then turned around in his seat, his eyes meeting Luffy's. For a while they just stared at each other assessingly, as if sizing each other up. Everyone in the bar had put their conversations on hold and looked on, including Nami and Kobe. They watched apprehensively, as if expecting a fight to break out. Finally, two wide grins slowly graced the two men's faces, and the tension seemed to cease as if never there. "Erica, can I get 2 more rounds over here?" The bartender nodded, looking relieved, and poured 2 more cups as Luffy sat down. Luffy had begun drinking sake fairly recently, but he had quickly discovered that his tolerance was almost as high as Zoro's. So, he began, "How has your day been?" It was an innocent question, but Zoro easily caught the meaning behind it. "Well," he began, "I woke up tied to a post, and quickly found myself being taunted by some dumbest kid who truly wasn't as stupid as he looked." While others listening in were confused by the odd contradiction, Luffy recognized this as an insult to Helmeppo's looks, rather than a compliment to his intelligence, and struggled to rein in his laughter. "I had to restrain myself from strangling him with the ropes that he was thoroughly convinced I couldn't escape from." This time, Luffy couldn't contain his laughter. There were some things that Zoro simply couldn't cut unarmed, but ropes were not one of them. "Don't worry," Luffy said as his laughter died down, "he'll grow up soon enough." Zoro grunted his acknowledgement of the statement that they both knew was at least partially true. "You didn't cut the marine base in half, did you?" Luffy asked. Zoro scoffed, while Nami and Kobe wondered if they had interpreted the ridiculous question correctly. What was with this conversation? Finally, Zoro's gaze fell on Kobe, and then it moved on to Nami, where it lingered for a bit. Nami shifted uncomfortably under his scrutinizing gaze. "They were your friends, Luffy?" he finally asked, breaking off the eye contact, much to Nami's relief. Luffy nodded at each of them as he introduced them. "The kid with the pink hair is Kobe. He wants to become a marine. As for the girl, she doesn't want to tell me her real name." He said it as if it was the most trivial thing in the world. Nami, on the other hand, had immediately tensed up, and her posture became more guarded. "He saw right through me, and went with it." She didn't know whether to feel amazed, fearful, or infuriated. Zoro raised a questioning eyebrow at Luffy, but the latter just shrugged. A silent conversation seemed to pass between the two, and Nami felt incredibly out of her depth. They could be plotting her death in great detail right now, and she wouldn't even know. Luffy spoke up after a while. "Well, Zoro, I really only have one piece of advice for you right now." Zoro looked at him curiously, and Luffy grinned. "Don't get stabbed by Buggy." Zoro now glared at him as if willing his own eyes to burn a hole through Luffy's head. Several people in the bar stiffened at the killer glare, but Nami was more focused on the piece of advice itself. She only knew of one person named Buggy. Luffy just looked back at him with the same amused smile, and after a few seconds Zoro looked away, and scoffed again. Then he did something their observers would never forget. "Pirate hunter!" Zoro burst out laughing. While Luffy and Zoro drank to their heart's content, Nami quickly excused herself from the bar. Luffy gave a polite goodbye, and said they'd meet again, which only served to unnerve her. She made her way out of the bar as Luffy ranted about how he desperately needed some meat, and she quickened her steps once she was out. Something about those two just made her want to get as far away as possible. Next stop, Marine Base. The bartender watched in exasperation as Luffy devoured plate after plate of food. His body was gradually expanding before their eyes, and some had lost their appetites just watching the process. Zoro simply kept eating as if it was completely natural. Luffy finished his last plate of food, and Zoro felt kind of guilty. Erica had offered him free food until he set out on his journey, and was quite gracious in extending that offer to a broke friend of his, but she obviously couldn't have accounted for Luffy's monster of a stomach. Luffy sighed in contentment, and stood up, his round physique sagging in response to the action. A few bystanders wondered how this was possible. When Luffy's face scrunched up in concentration, and his round physique rebounded into a slim figure, muscles bulging as if the mass had been redirected, they gave up trying to make sense of anything they were seeing. Once again, Zoro acted as if this was normal. "Ah, that's better," Luffy said in satisfaction. "I feel like I'm at full strength now." Zoro rolled his eyes. "I don't think we'll be back at full strength for a while, Luffy." Luffy nodded. "We'll talk about that later." Kobe, who had resignedly stopped trying to make sense of anything the two said as well, asked the obvious question. "Are you guys staying here for a while? Why did you need to meet up?" Luffy glanced at Kobe, and grinned. "Actually, we're going out to sea. Zoro is gonna be my first crewmate." Kobe gaped. "You mean as a pirate?" Luffy nodded, seemingly amused. "Yeah, what else?" Kobe tried to wrap his mind around the pirate hunter becoming a pirate. Mutterings broke out through the bar, and one of them turned to Zoro, confident due to his drunken state. Whoa. The pirate hunter Zoro is going to follow a pirate. Is that true?" Zoro, rather than addressing the question directly, turned back to Luffy. "So, when do we set sail, Captain?" They both ignored the increased volume of the mutterings. "Just as soon as we got a ship that could take us," Luffy replied cheerfully. Zoro facepalmed. Not this shit again. He really should have expected this. Some things never changed. "Hey, fellas. If it's a boat you need, I run a business selling small ones. You're welcome to take one. It's the least I can do after what you've done for our town. Zoro turned to the voice, and nodded gratefully. Thanks, that'd be really helpful. After that, they finished the last of their booze, and said their farewells to Kobe. Luffy told him to become a great marine, and always follow his own sense of justice, and he vowed that he would. Luffy and Zoro got their boat from the man who had volunteered his services, and led them to his shop at the coast of the island, and without further ado, they set sail for the place they knew to be called Orange Town. Getting there, on the other hand, was a different story. Luffy and Zoro marveled at the fact that they were able to get there once before, remembering that they had basically been wandering around aimlessly in search of a navigator, and by some stroke of luck, happened to find Nami. Zoro assured Luffy that Nami would go there, and that her presence the first time wasn't completely random. While he was raising hell in the marine base, he found a memo from Buggy the Clown in a safe that he knew wouldn't escape Nami's notice. They knew where Buggy was, and they didn't doubt that Nami would find him, so logically Orange Town was their next destination. However, they were getting increasingly frustrated by the second in the execution of actually getting there. Zoro was holding the map and compass, which should have immediately rung alarm bells in Luffy's head, but he wasn't much better at this, so he was rowing for now. He watched in awe as Zoro confidently pointed in the direction they needed to go. Luffy was impressed for a moment, wondering how on earth he'd done it, before turning skeptical. Wait a minute. How did you come to that conclusion? Zoro looked at him like he'd grown a second head. What? It's not that hard. This map says that Orange Town is to the west. That means that we need to go to the left, he said patronizingly. Ah, Luffy said, hitting his palm with his fist as his face lit up in realization at the sound logic. You're right. Okay, let's go. He picked up the oars, and happily started rowing, continuing for about 10 seconds before he fainted. He quickly got up, placing his arms above his head in the shape of an XUO. Rune. Zoro looked at him as if he was sporting 3 hats now. What's your problem, Luffy? He asked, annoyed. Influence? I was put under the influence. That's not how navigation works at all. For the way Zoro was looking at him now, he might as well be a fully grown hider. He pointed accusingly at Zoro. You didn't even use the compass. Zoro sighed. What do you take me for? He asked in exasperation. Of course I did. He pointed in the direction that they had been going in. The compass is pointing that way, so that's the way we need to go. Are you satisfied now? Luffy was stunned. Zoro really had been navigating with the map and compass. Suddenly he wanted to kick himself for doubting his comrade. He flashed Zoro a sheepish smile, and Zoro accepted the unspoken apology without comment. They rode in silence for 10 more minutes, before the extent of the fallacious reasoning hit Luffy, with all the force of one his crazy-ass grandpa's mountain-crushing fists. Fuck. Luffy and Zoro argued back and forth until they agreed on their best course of action, which basically involved reaching out as far as they could with their observation haki. If they found any human oars, then they found an island. Simple enough. As they wandered around aimlessly for a while just to cover more area, Luffy was the first to sense them. They were faint. 3 oars just a little beyond the horizon. Zoro couldn't sense them yet, his observation haki was weaker, but as they got closer, he confirmed Luffy's findings. As the island came into sight, Zoro spoke up. I still say I had that under control. We just had to keep going left to the end. Luffy let his blatant disbelief show on his face, not really caring anymore. You know Zoro, I've been thinking about this for a while, but if we continuously went left, wouldn't we just be going in a circle? Zoro scoffed. As if I'd go in a circle trying to go in a straight line. What do you take me for, Luffy? Rather than dignifying this with a response, Luffy instead opted to jump out of the boat, hovering in the air using Geppo as he faced Zoro. Try to keep up, Luffy said, grinning as he knew that Zoro could not perform the technique, having never bothered to learn it. He shot off in the direction of the island as Zoro developed a tick over his eye, and started rowing furiously. He reached the town pretty quickly, and skywalked around a bit, taking in the sights. He was high enough so that civilians weren't likely to take notice. Then again, he knew this island was the one they were searching for by now, and he also knew that there were more than just civilians in town. As if reacting to this revelation, a cannonball came into his peripheral vision. It was aimed right at him. He could have maneuvered out of the way pretty easily, but he quickly came up with a better idea, a devious smirk adorning his face. This seemed familiar, so if his timing was right, he took the cannonball hat on, and got shot down, landing with a crash onto the ground, and making a hole in the pavement. 4 witnesses stopped running, and looked at his unmoving form, 1 in curiosity, and 3 in slight sympathy. Captain Buggy must have targeted the guy, whoever he was. Well, never mind that. The 3 armed men turned to the 4th person, who was by no means armed, unless you counted the map in her hand. She prepared to run again when the alleged corpse stood up, and dusted itself off, attracting their attention again. Shoot first, ask questions later, huh? I guess I shouldn't expect anything less from that clown, the man who was very much alive said to himself. The girl's eyes widened as she immediately recognized him. Now she really couldn't stay. She had enough troublesome people to deal with at the moment. Boss. She shouted with feigned glee. The pirates looked from new arrival to her, and back to the new arrival. You're here, she continued. Great. Mind taking care of these guys for me? I got the map, so I'll head back to the ship. Luffy watched, amused, as she hastily retreated without giving him time to potentially refute her words. Not that he would. Actually, he was planning on holding her to the statement that he was her boss now. He honestly wasn't surprised that Nami had beaten them here despite the fact that they had left first. She had no doubt gone in an actual straight line to get here. Still, this was pretty lucky. The pirates quickly rounded on him, completely missing the sharp turn that Nami took, as she sprinted behind the houses to their left. So you're her boss, huh? I guess we can just take you to Captain Buggy, then. Luffy scoffed. Sorry, I already have an appointment with Big Nose, and I'd rather only make one trip. The pirates looked outraged, and slightly fearful at the disrespect the man showed, before falling into an unconscious heap on the ground. Nami climbed one of the rooftops to get a better view of the fight, which was over. The three men had been beaten easily. She smirked. If she could get a monster to fight her battles, why shouldn't she? Hey, you, she called. He looked up at her, and she waved. Nice job down there. You kicked their asses. She hesitated, then added, mind if I treat you to some food? I have a proposition for you. Luffy nodded in agreement. Despite knowing what this would lead to, he wasn't about to turn down free food. As Nami led her to an abandoned house, Luffy frowned. He knew what he could say to get Nami to join them, but he wanted her to follow him out of loyalty and trust, not out of mutual need, and he didn't even entertain the thought of manipulating her. Taking advantage of what he knew about his future crewmates would make him feel like the scum of the earth. No, Nami needed to follow him out of her own free will, and he needed to provide her with a place where she belonged. Anything less would make him no different than Arlong. So it was with that line of thought that Luffy sat down and resigned himself to the plan that was forming in his mind. It was a reckless plan, but Luffy was a reckless person, and he could hardly imagine that they'd be in any danger, even if Nami repeated her exact actions from the previous timeline. And so far, she was doing just that. The only difference was that she still hadn't told him her name. She suggested that they work together for a while. She had navigational skills he needed, and he could really throw a punch. When Luffy asked if she would join his crew, she hesitated, and said that she would only join temporarily. Satisfied for now, he mentioned that they were pirates. He didn't miss the hardening of her eyes, but she went on as if the information didn't matter. Their proposition was to infiltrate Buggy's base of operations together, and split their treasure 60/40ths. Luffy found it pretty hilarious that she would suggest an uneven split of the profits, when she wasn't actually planning on keeping her end of the bargain. He wondered if that was just thrown in to make it more believable. But that was Nami for you. Cunning, opportunistic, and, taking into account that her plan involved both of them getting away, slightly naive. But that would change soon enough. Luffy heard her out, and agreed to the plan. Nami didn't tie him up with ropes this time. He briefly wondered why, but quickly dismissed it as Nami, recognizing that he wasn't as stupid as he made people believe. But while they walked towards the area that Buggy's crew was occupying, a small grin stretched across Luffy's face as he realized that Nami had adapted to this minor detail, and simply planned to betray him when they got there. Luffy nearly laughed at the thought of her naivety as they continued to walk, but caught himself. Nami wasn't stupid. Far from it. Her true problem was that she was blinded by her preconceptions and common sense. She thought ahead, but she didn't account for all the possibilities like, say, Robin did. Something that she didn't account for could really throw a wrench in her plans, even a trivial detail like her not having the strength to carry that much gold. She also didn't account for the fact that Luffy could beat the crap out of Buggy's crew while tied up and blindfolded, but that couldn't really be expected of her. A few pirates took notice of them as they walked into the plaza and signaled their captain. Buggy showed up and looked at them with no small amount of hostility. This was the bitch that stole their map and that annoying boss of hers. When his henchmen had returned and made their report, Buggy had refrained from flaying them alive, deciding to save it for the thieves. They were certainly making this easy, though. What do you flashy bastards want? I hope you're here to return the map you stole. Nami took on a devious grin as her plan unfolded. In no more than a few seconds, Luffy's hands and torso were tied up with a rope that seemed to come out of nowhere. She really was good at this. That's right. I'm sick of working for this guy. I've come to return the map and join your crew. You can have my boss as a gift, she shouted. Buggy looked thoughtful at this turn of events, and then started laughing. I guess you're not as stupid as I originally thought. What's your name then? Nami straightened, and gave him the same fake name that she had given Luffy. Figures. Pirates soon surrounded Luffy, and he rolled his eyes. This was the part where he'd have to show restraint. Luffy wasn't really good with restraint. In fact, when two thugs shoved him in a cage that he easily remembered, he couldn't help but knock them out with a blast of Conqueror's Haki. This could have been a problem had they not been drinking so much, but as it was, the surrounding pirates just laughed, thinking it was simply the effect of the binge. Nami's eyes narrowed, but she dismissed it in favor of scanning the area discreetly. She quickly located a key that she was pretty sure was to the cage, the map of the Grand Line which was handed to Boogie after she had surrendered it, and a heavily guarded building that was most likely their treasure vault. Alright, everybody. I'm in a flashy good mood right now, so drink to your heart's content in celebration. The pirates roared in approval at Boogie's announcement, and Nami smirked as she started drinking as well. She would be the only one without a hangover after this, and it would be all too easy for them to get away with the treasure and the map, which she would gladly take for herself before fleeing the island. All according to plan. Her confidence faltered, however, as she took note of a dozen pirates shoving a huge cannon into the middle of the plaza. And now, Boogie shouted, I think a demonstration of our power and the glory of the Boogie pirate crew is in order. He turned to Nami. Call it an initiation, he said as she looked on apprehensively. The pirates lit the fuse of the cannon, which was facing the direction of the town, and fired. Nami's eyes widened as the cannonball blew through several houses, completely destroying them. She quickly realized why all the houses in the area were abandoned. She turned back, and realized that they were now pointing the cannon towards the cage Luffy was in. She rounded on Boogie. Wait, what are you? Boogie was grinning widely. Like I said, call it an initiation. To prove your loyalty, I thought it would only be fair if you got the honor of disposing of that pathetic former boss of yours. Nami's eyes widened further. Oh, this cannot be happening. Luffy watched as the pirates loaded the Boogie ball into the cannon, and Nami stuttered nervously, trying to convince Boogie that this really wasn't necessary. Boogie handed her a match. Do it, he said simply. Nami broke out into a cold sweat, and she turned back to Luffy, who could see she was torn. I wonder, do you have the resolve of a pirate? If not, you'll never get far in this crazy world of ours, he told her. Nami's face darkened. And what's that? The resolve to kill without a second thought. She spat. Luffy shook his head, and grinned fiercely. The resolve to put your life on the line. Nami's hands trembled as her options were spelled out for her. She could fire the cannon, and survive, proving that she was no better than the common scum that populated the world, or she could face death, and stay true to her convictions. She was broken out of her thoughts as a pirate grabbed the match from her hands. Her eyes hardened as she found her resolve. She would never be like one of these common murderers. Come on, don't you know how to light a match? You just... He was abruptly interrupted mid-sentence as Nami's staff collided with his face, and he was thrown back onto the ground, cursing in pain. The surrounding pirates looked outraged at the act of betrayal, but Boogie just sighed, and got his knives out. He was disappointed, but he'd been expecting as much. Luffy looked on with interest, but decided that he'd seen enough. This was getting dangerous for Nami very quickly. He broke out of the ropes, and shoved his foot up through the top of the cage, disconnected from the bars, and landed in a crumpled heap on the ground behind the cage. This caught pretty much everyone's attention, but they quickly lost sight of him as he jumped up into the air, and let loose another blast of Conqueror's Haki, this time targeting all of the pirates in the area. Bodies fell to the ground left and right until the only ones left standing were Nami and Boogie. Nami looked around in shock at the phenomenon, and at the new development. He could have escaped at any time. What is he playing at? And what did he do just now? Meanwhile, Boogie was fuming. He recognized the king's will when he saw it. How could this nobody thief possibly possess the same power that Captain Roger and Uncle Rayleigh had? Even Kabaji had fainted. Regardless, it didn't matter. He was no pushover. He had sailed the new world and witnessed clashes between gods. He wouldn't have survived this long if he had never gained an immunity to the ability. It would take more than that to bring him down. Hey, Luffy. I finally found you, you bastard. Everyone turned to the new presence that had made itself known, and Luffy laughed. I'm impressed, Zoro. Who knew that you were capable of finding anything? Zoro brushed off the insult and replied, it was easy. I just went to the noisiest spot on the island, knowing that's where you'd be. Looks like you've caused quite the commotion. He smirked. You know, I half expected to find you tied up and in a cage. Luffy glared at him half-heartedly. Was this revenge? Nami, although frantic by this point, easily made sense of the comment. Had Zoro been there this whole time? How long had he been shadowing them? She was about to voice the question when a very angry Boogie interrupted them. Don't ignore me, you flashy sons of bitches. He addressed Zoro. You pirate hunter Zoro, aren't you? What the hell are you doing here? Have you come for my bounty? Zoro looked at him lazily. Nope, not interested. Boogie grinned. Oh, but you see, I'm interested. After I take you out, I'll be that much more famous, he said, twirling his knives in his hands. Zoro sighed. Fine. Come on then. Luffy chuckled, remembering how this went last time, and Zoro shot him an annoyed look. Boogie made his move. Bar cannon. Boogie's hand quite literally flew off of his arm, and headed for Zoro. Nami's face was pure comedy. What the hell is going on? She felt incredibly out of her depth again. But that wasn't as surprising as what happened next. Zoro disappeared before her eyes, and Boogie let out a pained yell. She looked over at Boogie, and saw the blood seeping from the wound in his side, where Zoro had evidently just cut him. How? The word echoed through Boogie's mind as he lost consciousness. Luffy smiled down at the dog in front of him as he crouched down, and held out his hand. Shake, he said. The dog looked up at him assessingly, and then surprisingly, held out his paw. Luffy grabbed it, and shook his hand up and down, and the dog just looked at him passively, as if this was a strange occurrence for him. "Hey, you kids." The group of 3 turned to the voice, 2 out of 3 recognizing him as the mayor of Orangetown. The man stopped in front of them, and looked at them curiously. "Do you know what's going on? I saw those blasted pirates destroying the town again with that cursed cannon of theirs. I came to investigate, and saw you 3 running away from their base. You're not hurt, are you?" He looked absently at Chaochu. The dog didn't get along with people he didn't know. His behavior was borderline aggressive towards strangers, but he acted civil with this teenager. "Strange." "Nah," Luffy replied cheerfully. "We kicked their asses." The mayor was taken aback by this statement, and looked at him disbelievingly. These pirates had been terrorizing their town for a while. Luffy, seeing his skepticism, added, "You might want to call the Marines while they're still unconscious. They'll wake up after a while." Nami, who'd been staring at the ground ever since they left the plaza, not wanting to meet Luffy's eyes, looked up at the new arrival. "Are you in charge here?" The man nodded. "I'm the mayor. But I hardly deserve the title at this point. I can't even protect my town from pillaging." Luffy thought that this was hardly his job to begin with, but didn't comment. "Well, we'll be on our way then," Luffy said. "Remember to mention that the boogie pirates are incapacitated when you call them. They'll be much more likely to send a retrieval ship that way." Nami agreed wholeheartedly with the cynical logic. The mayor looked at them with interest. "Are you 3 sailors?" Luffy nodded. "Pirates. We just recruited a navigator," he said, pointing at Nami, who looked down again. Luffy frowned. She was acting pretty strange, and he could sense the guilt she was feeling. She had almost forgotten their original objective when they were about to leave, but Luffy had made sure to grab the treasure and the map. "I'll have to confirm your story myself," the mayor said after some thought. "If what you say is true, then you have my sincerest thanks." Luffy nodded at him, and the 3 of them headed out towards the coast where their ships were docked. As they walked, Nami finally looked up at Luffy, and spoke. "Do you really still want me as your navigator?" He turned to her, and nodded eagerly in response to the question. "I tricked you," she reminded him. "I almost got you killed." Luffy thought about telling her that there was no way he ever would have died at the hands of Buggy, or anyone in East Blue for that matter, but decided to be subtler than that. "I'm alive, aren't I?" he said. Nami just stared at him, wondering not for the first time how his mind worked. "You're not mad?" she asked quietly. Luffy smiled widely. "Nah, don't worry about it," he replied. Nami let a small smile grace her lips but still felt guilty. She didn't have the heart to tell him that she couldn't join his crew permanently. She was so close. Sadness welled up inside her. She was really starting to like Luffy despite his affiliation as a pirate, but this couldn't last. "I know this is really late, but my name is Nami," she told him. Luffy's smile grew wider. "Welcome to the crew, Nami," he responded. "Where do you want to go next, then?" If she couldn't stay in the crew, then she'd be damn sure to do her job well while she was here. "Our next destination is Syrup Village," he replied. Nami looked thoughtful. She knew where it was. It was a small village on the Gecko Island southwest of here. What did Luffy plan on doing there? She doubted there was anything of significance. They tied their 2 boats together, and set sail. As the island grew more distant, Nami noticed with slight panic that there was only 1 bag of treasure on the boat. They had separated everything into 2. Luffy. Where's the other bag of gold?" she asked nervously. "Ah, I left it on the shore for the townspeople." It took a moment for this statement to register in Nami's mind. "You left it? That was worth at least 5 million belly," she yelled in frustration. Luffy just nodded. "They're not a very wealthy town. They'll need it for repairs. Besides, you said we'd split the profits. I just gave them my share." Nami gave up, and her head sagged. She had said that, and she didn't feel very deserving of that extra 10% right about now. Luffy observed Nami out of the corner of his eye. She was definitely getting more comfortable around the 2 of them, but she was still slightly disconcerted after everything she'd witnessed them do. Nami was used to using her cunning to manipulate circumstances to her advantage, and she felt way out of her comfort zone when she didn't feel in control of a situation. But that was kind of the point. Luffy wanted her to feel completely at ease around them, not because she could control everything, but because she trusted them to watch her back, so that she wouldn't have to constantly look over her shoulder. It was still a work in progress. On the way to the next island, Luffy and Zoro quickly got bored. They left the navigation to Nami, not that they could have helped much, and started playing rock paper scissors of all things. The dull game was made even blander by Zoro's unyielding belief that rock was the strongest, no matter how many times it lost to paper. They eventually passed by a small uninhabited island, and Luffy suggested they stop there to take a stretch. It was by far the strangest island Nami had ever seen. The animals were all odd hybrids of different land mammals, and a small man stuck in a chest who claimed he was the god of the island confronted them. He had been stranded there ever since his crew left without him after searching the island for treasure. Luffy later found what they'd been looking for, but revealed that there hadn't actually been anything in the chests. Gaiman, as he told them his name was, decided to stay on the island and look after the animals there. After that, it wasn't long before they reached their destination. As the island came into sight, both Luffy and Zoro felt waves of nostalgia upon sensing the familiar presence on the coast. Soon, 3 other oars joined him. They stretched their arms and legs as they walked onto the shore, and it wasn't long before Nami noticed them. "Hey, we're being watched." They all turned toward their observers, and 3 of them instantly ran back towards the town. "Hey, don't run away before it even begins," the 4th one shouted. He nervously turned back to the newcomers and raised a green slingshot. "Stop right there. I am Captain Usopp, the great protector of this village. State your business here, otherwise my 80 million followers will chase you to the ends of hell." Luffy and Zoro exchanged an amused glance as Nami looked at the eccentric villager with disinterest. "Damn," Luffy said. "He's got over 1/10 of the world's population as followers. That is pretty impressive." "Maybe we should run," Zoro added. Usopp gulped, doing the maths in his head. He hadn't really thought that one through, but it looked like they were buying it. Maybe this would work. "He's lying," Nami stated in a bored tone. "Crap. I've been found out," Usopp exclaimed as Luffy burst out laughing. Usopp swayed back and forth comically as he wondered out loud what he was to do now that he'd been discovered. Nami almost looked guilty for what she'd reduced him to. He quickly recovered though. "Don't you dare laugh," he said firmly with his slingshot raised. "I am a man of intense pride. I don't take well to being laughed at. That's why everyone calls me the Proud." This was another lie. No one called him that, but they didn't have any proof of that, did they? "Hey, calm down," Luffy managed as his laughter subsided. "You're Yasuf's son, right? Let's just talk about things over food. We're not here to pillage or anything." Usopp lost his balance and fell off the hill he was standing on, landing face first in the dirt. He got up with an embarrassed expression. "It's true that I'm Yasuf's son, but how did you know?" Luffy smiled genuinely. "You remind me of him. Even the way you gloat is the same." Usopp's chest swelled up with pride upon hearing this, and he agreed to talk things over as a restaurant town. He even went as far as to offer to treat them. Nami noted that the restaurant they were eating at had a sign that simply said food. This suggested that it was basically the only restaurant in the area. This really was a small village. As they ate, Luffy told Usopp stories of the boy's father and his incredible marksmanship, and Usopp listened eagerly. His eyes bulged out when Luffy mentioned that he was the sniper for the crew of red-haired Shanks. He always knew his father was amazing, but it felt good to hear someone confirm it. He soon excused himself from the restaurant, though, saying that he had somewhere to be soon. They continued eating after Usopp left until the 3 kids from earlier rushed into the restaurant, almost falling over each other. "We're here to defend the village, Captain," one shouted with newfound resolve. He then looked around confused. "Where's Captain Usopp?" another demanded, holding up a wooden toy dagger in what he hoped to be a menacing manner. "Ah, that was some good meat," Luffy sighed, patting his stomach in satisfaction. The 3 kids looked at him in horror. "What? No way. Don't tell me you ate the captain," the 3rd one shouted indignantly. Luffy looked at him in obvious amusement. Nami giggled. "About you, Captain," Zoro said, catching their attention. He put on his best evil grin. He was delicious. Once Nami managed to calm them down enough to convince them it was a joke, Luffy asked if they knew why Usopp took off in such a hurry. One of them, who introduced himself as Carrot, replied that he usually went up to the mansion on the hill to recite his far-fetched stories to the girl that lived there. They explained that she was always sick and isolated, and that Usopp's lies cheered her up. Luffy got up. "Alright, let's go then." Carrot looked up at him. "We're actually not allowed to go there," he said disappointedly. "Captain gets in through a secret entrance," the boy that had introduced himself as Pepper added proudly. "All the more reason why we should go," Luffy said casually. Nami wanted to protest the logic, but the 3 boys cheered and took off in the direction of the hill, led by the boy who had introduced himself as Onion. Luffy laughed and trailed after them, while Zoro followed wordlessly. Nami sighed as she was outvoted. A tall gate surrounded the mansion, stretching around the full perimeter. The vegetable trio was wondering if they could find the captain's way in when something wrapped tightly around the waists of Zoro, Nami, Pepper, Carrot, and Onion. "Gomu Gomu no," Luffy said jovially. The entire group, minus Zoro, looked in shock from Luffy to what was wrapped around them, and back to Luffy. It was his arm. It was coiled around them like a snake. His other arm was also stretched out, and had grabbed the top of the gate. Before anyone could question the absurdity of what was currently happening, Luffy shouted, "Sorry to intrude." They tried to avoid the inevitable, but were pulled along with him as he launched himself past the gate, and high into the air. Luffy just enjoyed the breeze as the rest of them, minus Zoro, screamed their lungs out. Before they landed, Zoro pulled free of his grip, knowing this would only be painful if his landing was dependent on his captain, who wasn't exactly worried about him dying from a fall like this. He landed on his feet and skidded in a long line before finally coming to a stop. Luffy stuck the landing with his knees bent and one arm wrapped around his captive passengers, which were dangling above his head, gasping for breath. He promptly let go of them, his arm snapping back to his side as they fell to the ground in a thud. Infiltration was successful, he said formally. Like hell it was. Nami shouted, wondering how they were still alive. She was about to ask what the hell he just did, but was trying to find the right words, and the Veggie trio beat her to it. That was awesome. Pepper shouted. Can we do that again? Carrot pleaded. How did you do that? Onion demanded. Luffy addressed them in order as he turned to each of them. Yes it was. Maybe later. I ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi. I'm a rubber man. Rubber man, Nami repeated helplessly, and her head sagged. Of all the ridiculous things in the world. Zoro looked at her, and raised an eyebrow. How could you not know by now? He asked disbelievingly. Nami rounded on him with her fists raised. I've never seen him do that before, she said defensively. I assumed that you were just superhumans or something. The devil fruits are supposed to be a legend. Don't tell me you ate one too. No, not me, Zoro said. Boogie ate one, though. Nami's eyes widened in realization. Come to think of it, he has shot his hand off of his arm. How has she not questioned that event further? Was hanging around these guys numbing her reactions to things like this? Would she soon be taking it in stride every time her conceptions of reality were skewed? The thought dismayed her. Hey, what the hell are you guys doing here? Nami turned to the familiar voice. She hadn't noticed Usopp up in the tree until now. He was on a branch level with an open window that a young girl was leaning out of. Nami opened her mouth to respond, but paused. What were they doing here? Luffy grinned widely, and pointed at Usopp. We're here to recruit you. Usopp's eyes widened to epic proportions. Recruit him? Weren't they pirates? Excitement welled up inside him, but we quickly compassed ourselves. He pointed to himself confidently. Finally, someone recognizes my talent. Tell you what. Let me be the captain, and I'll join you, he said with his arms crossed, and a confident smirk on his face. No way. Luffy shouted, still smiling. This caused Usopp to lose his balance, and almost fall out of the tree. You can be a sniper, though. I'll bet you have really good marksmanship, he added. This caught Usopp's attention, and he almost forgot about being captain. You bet I do. You won't find a better sniper in all of East Blue. They all looked at the bold statement with mixed reactions. Nami was wondering what kind of sniper used a slingshot, Zoro was wondering how he could know that when he'd never left his island, and Luffy was thinking that despite Usopp's nature for blatant lies, his statement might actually be true. The girl leaning out the window, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. Are these friends of yours, Usopp? Usopp looked at her, and waved his hand dismissively. Oh, them? They're just fans of mine. They wanted to join my awesome pirate crew. Nami felt embarrassed for the guy. Did he have no humility? Luffy had just invited him. Come to think of it, he hadn't really given an answer yet, but Luffy seemed complacent as if he had already said yes. Hey, you delinquents. What do you think you're doing? Everyone, minus Luffy and Zoro, turned to the new voice. It was a tall man with slick black hair and round glasses. He wore a formal suit and tie, and walked with rigidity. Usopp and Kaya stilled upon seeing him. He stopped in front of the tree, and looked at everyone other than Kaya with distaste. You're all trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave now. Clahatter. It's okay, we were just talking. You don't need to kick them out, Kaya said pleadingly. The caretaker looked at Kaya, and shook his head. I cannot allow this, Miss Kaya. Your condition is bad enough without that ruffian's influence. I will not allow him to poison your mind with his ridiculous fabrications. Usopp was trying his best to take the not-so-subtle insults in stride, but everyone could tell he was having trouble. Kaya looked angry but held her tongue. Nami was confused. Kaya did look pale, but not letting her have visitors wouldn't help at all. If anything, Usopp's visits should aid her mental well-being. What she needed was social interaction, not isolation from her peers. Didn't this Clahatter realize that he could very well be making her condition worse by insisting on her seclusion? She looked at Luffy and Zoro to see their reactions. They were staring at each other intensely as if they were having a conversation minus the conversation. Nami grew annoyed as Zoro nodded at Luffy, and they both turned back to observe the scene before them. How did they do that anyway? How did it even work? Usopp, although disgruntled, decided to ignore the insult and try to reason with the caretaker. Listen, I'm sorry I trespassed, and I don't want any trouble or anything. I just thought Kaya could use the company. She never sees anyone, and... Clahatter interrupted. Do you presume to insinuate that you know what would best aid in Miss Kaya's recovery better than her own caretaker? What could a person of your upbringing possibly know about her needs? Usopp was really having a hard time compassing himself now. Upbringing. What do you mean by that? Kaya was looking at her caretaker in horror. Neither Clahatter didn't notice that he had offended or didn't care. He continued, of course, I suppose I shouldn't set such high standards from the son of a filthy pirate. Breaking and entering must be second nature to you, but I'm afraid I must ask that you not come back. He was forcefully interrupted as Usopp's fists collided with his face. He fell back onto the ground and glared up at him in annoyance. Don't worry, Usopp said quietly. I was just leaving. He turned around and stomped out of the compound, the infuriated scowl never leaving his face. Kaya had covered her mouth and was watching him leave with regret. The Veggie trio shouted insults at Clahatter for good measure before running off after their captain. Luffy motioned for Zoro and Nami to follow him as he too turned to leave. Nami took one sad look at Kaya before following. She felt bad for her, but wasn't really in a position to help in any way. When they get back to the restaurant, Luffy tells Zoro and Nami to hang out while he goes to look for Usopp. Zoro nodded. Nami wondered what he was planning to say. Luffy found Usopp sitting under a tree at the edge of a cliff. He walked over and sat down next to him. Usopp noticed but didn't look at him. He was lost in his own thoughts. After a while, Luffy said, "It's not her fault, you know." Usopp still didn't turn to look at him. "No, it's not," he said. "And your visits are helping her," Luffy added. Usopp looked up at the clouds and sighed. "Yeah, I know," he said. Luffy nodded. That was that, then. They sat in silence for a minute before Luffy nudged Usopp, who looked up at him in question. Luffy put one finger to his lips and then pointed down at the beach. Usopp followed his finger and stiffened as he spotted Clahatter walking towards an eccentrically dressed man with heart-shaped sunglasses that he had never seen before. Already suspicious, Usopp got down on his stomach and looked over the ledge, and Luffy followed suit. As they listened in on the conversation that was being held below them, Usopp's eyes gradually widened in shock and then narrowed in outrage. Luffy kept a consistent focused glare on his face until the two men below them parted and walked in opposite directions. Usopp waited a few seconds to take in everything he had just heard, and then got up and abruptly started running in the direction of the village. Luffy quickly caught up and grabbed him by the arm, stopping him in his tracks. "Let go. I have to warn them," he shouted now that they were out of earshot. "Will they believe you? Can they even help anything if they do?" Luffy asked quietly. Usopp's eyes whitened as he realized the obvious answer to both questions. His expression turned troubled, and he looked at the ground. "Then what can I do? This is the village I grew up in, I can't just abandon them to their fate." Luffy nodded in acknowledgement and, having been prompted for advice, started brainstorming a plan out loud. Usopp kept a focused expression and nodded every now and then, as well as throwing in his own suggestions. By the time they met up with Zoro and Nami, the Veggie trio was nowhere in sight. Luffy and Usopp filled them in on what happened. Nami looked mildly disturbed but kept calm, while Zoro's expression conveyed nothing of his thoughts. With the plan decided on, the four started making preparations for the following morning. Usopp walked towards the beach with a stern expression, contemplating what was about to go down. He always lied to the townspeople, claiming that pirates were coming. He would ensure that it remained a lie. The sun was rising, and Usopp was fidgeting in anticipation of the coming conflict. There were two slopes that led up to the village from opposite ends of the island, and Zoro had suggested that they split into two pairs to cover both sides. Luffy and Usopp covered the coast where they had eavesdropped on Clahatter, or rather, Captain Kuro, Usopp reminded himself, while Zoro and Nami covered the opposite side. Usopp had asked how they would signal each other when one group engaged the pirates, and Luffy cryptically stated that he and Zoro had it covered. As the sun completed its ascension above the horizon, Usopp wondered how much longer they should wait. Suddenly, Luffy's head perked up. "They're here. They're coming from the other side." Usopp's eyes widened. "How do you know?" he asked skeptically. "Zoro signaled me," Luffy replied. He grabbed Usopp's arm. "Hang on. It's gonna be a rough ride." He then used his legs to launch them both high into the air, and started using Geppo to get them to the other side quickly. Zoro had been suppressing his aura enough that Luffy hadn't been able to sense it from across the island, until it had suddenly erupted from his location once again. That was their signal. It was simple yet effective, and no one other than the two of them could interpret it. The eyes would have widened comically if they weren't shut tightly in response to the wind rushing at their faces. Okay, this was ridiculous. He had overheard that Luffy had eaten a devil fruit and was a rubber man. To his credit, he had only blinked when he heard that. But that didn't explain why Luffy could fly. Was he even human? It was about a 6-kilometer stretch between the two coasts, and he crossed it in less than a minute. Usopp was a good runner, but it would have taken him at least 10 minutes to go that distance. Zoro took notice of them as they touched down on the slope leading down to the north shore. Nami spotted them, and frowned in curiosity. Zoro had said he was signaling Luffy a minute ago. How did they get here so fast? It wasn't long before a large ship with the mark of the Black Cat pirates pulled onto the shore, and the roar of pirates itching to pillage the village became discernible. They rushed off of the ship and flooded onto the path, running up the hill before stopping when the unexpected sight of their opposition reached their eyes. They looked at each other in confusion, having been told that no one would be expecting them. "Hey Django," one of them shouted back to the ship. "There are a bunch of teenagers in the way. I thought this was supposed to be a surprise attack." Django looked a little confused as well, but shouted back, "Does it matter? If they're in the way, just kill them. We're in a rush. Captain Kuro told us to meet him by morning." Before the pirate that had given his report could turn back to address the four of them, he felt a painful sting in his back and fell over onto the ground. The other pirates traced the path of the projectile back to one of the teenagers, who had a small green slingshot raised. They scowled, having been robbed of first blood. Zoro grinned in approval. "First a hit wins. Yusuf's legs trembled as the pirates charged in on him. He shot a few more pellets out, each of them hitting their target as he backed away. He would lose control of the fight once they got to him. Unfortunately, his shots weren't lethal, and once the fallen pirates got past their pain, they got up and continued their charge with renewed vigor. They eventually reached him, and blades surrounded him as he rushed to reload another pellet. He wasn't going to make it. He flinched as the swords bore down on him. The blades were halted mid-swing, however, and Yusuf looked up to see several pirates desperately pushing against a single sword with all their might. Yusuf watched his savior with awe as the swordsman held back the blades that he had intercepted with deadly precision without budging an inch. He pushed them off balance with a quick swipe of his weapon, and began cutting them down one by one with cold efficiency. Not a single blade reached him. The pirates chose to ignore Yusuf for now, and swarmed the swordsman like wasps. Yusuf began to worry as Zoro was surrounded, but he promptly spun around, and swung his sword in a circular circumference. The pirates were blown away by the wind produced by the swing, and the rock walls surrounding the path abruptly stopped some of them. But as even the ones who didn't hit the walls failed to get back up, Yusuf realized there was more to it. They all had deep gashes where the wind had hit them. Had he just cut them from a distance? Yusuf watched in fascination, and even Nami looked up from the pirate she was redundantly bludgeoning into the ground with her staff. The pirates stopped charging, now wary of the foe that had already taken down a fourth of their members. They quickly realized that it was suicide to take him on close range. The majority of the pirates cursed their lack of funds as a select few pulled out pistols and started shooting at Zoro. The swordsman almost looked insulted, and Yusuf's eyes bulged out as he gracefully deflected their fire. Nami also looked on with an awestruck impression. He wasn't lining his swords up with the gun barrels to block their aim. He was reacting to the projectiles after they were fired. She wouldn't have guessed that such a feat was possible. Yusuf turned to Luffy and shouted over the gunshots. He can deflect gunfire. Luffy smirked. Is that what it looks like? Yusuf turned back, and his eyes widened further as he saw what Luffy was implying. Zoro wasn't deflecting the bullets. He was cutting them in half. The pirates finally ran out of ammo, and Zoro grinned mockingly. Are you done yet? They looked at him in fury with a hint of fear, and charged again. The pirate leading the charge leapt at him with a giant hammer, intent on smashing his precious sword. The stone hammer was cut down the middle, the two halves falling off of the stick to which it had been attached. Its wielder backed up in fear, but the pirates behind him were still charging. Zoro raised his blade into a horizontal ready position, as if he was about to swat them all away from a distance, when a voice behind made him stop and duck. Gomu Gomu no whip. Luffy's leg blurred from sight, and the charging pirates were all swept off their feet and knocked into the solid wall of rock. Don't hog all the fun, Zoro, Luffy pouted. You could have jumped in at any time, he replied. Django was getting frustrated. Half of their crew had been taken out now. He got out his hypnotic ring, and turned towards their remaining forces, which were visibly cowering. Failure is not an option, you dipshits, he shouted. When I say 1, 2, Django, your cowardice will disappear, and you will become stronger. 1, 2, Django. The men's eyes hardened, and their muscles bulged. As if they had completely forgotten the slaughter that had just occurred, they let out a battle cry, and charged forward with their fists in the air. Ugh. Luffy grinned, and threw his fists above his head as he dashed forward, yelling, Aog, in mocking imitation. The pirates were not deterred at all under their hypnotic influence. Gomu Gomu no Luffy's fists seemed to multiply for a second before they blurred out of sight, much like his leg earlier. Gatling. The Black Cat pirates, for all their miraculous mental steroids, dropped like flies as they were mowed down by the invisible assault. Django cringed. If this kept up, Kuro would have their heads. Sham. Buchi. Come show these fools what happens to those who mess with the Black Cat pirates. 2 more pirates jumped down from the ship. One was slim, and one not so slim. It was clear that both took the cat thing way too far, though. They looked at Zoro fearfully, then turned back to Django, and fell to their knees groveling. What are you trying to do to us, Django? The slim one sobbed. They just took down most of our crew. There's no way we can fight those guys, the larger one said miserably. Whatever, Django replied, pulling out his hypnotic ring again. When I say 1, 2, Django, you will both stop groveling, and get stronger. 1, 2, Django. The 2 men's muscles bulged considerably, but their sobbing only intensified. Django developed a tick over his eye. Alright, that's enough already. Get your asses in gear before I kick them from here to the red line. The 2 cat-like men jumped and ran clumsily in the direction of Luffy and Zoro, arms flailing and tears still trailing down their faces. Django scowled. That act of theirs was annoying and unnecessary. They were already late. Luffy and Zoro looked at each other with raised eyebrows as the 2 homo made their way over to them. You don't want to do that, Luffy said in a bored tone. We tend to get less merciful when our enemies don't get the message, Zoro said lazily. Sham and Buchi continued, breaking off from each other to confront the 2. Their arms were still flailing randomly as they drew closer. Luffy sighed. As they came into range, the doubt disappeared from their faces, and their movements became more fluid and purposeful. Nami and Usopp watched in horror as the smirks developed on their faces, contrasting with their false tears. Sham and Buchi lunged forward, claws intent on digging into flesh. These two had severely underestimated them. Buchi impaled himself on Zoro's sword, and his arms fell toward his sides as he coughed up blood. Sham threw himself into Luffy's outstretched leg, and felt his ribcage shatter as the crimson liquid spilled from his lips as well. "Oh well," Luffy said. "We did warn them," Zoro finished. Django gritted his teeth in anger. Those useless felines had been defeated so easily. "I have no choice now," he spoke under his breath. "I'll have to hypnotize myself and finish this. Captain Kuro will be here soon." Actually, a voice came from behind him. "Your captain is already here." Django spun around and almost stumbled as he faced the green-haired swordsman. When had the man gotten behind him? How had he not noticed the man's approach? He jumped back but froze when a familiar voice came from the direction of the village. "Django," it said menacingly, "didn't I tell you all to meet me at the mansion?" Django didn't dare turn around to face his death, but he could tell that the man was walking closer. Kuro stopped in front of Luffy, and a fierce scowl spread across his face. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted. This galvanized Django back into action. He whipped out his ring and faced Zoro. "When I say 1, 2, Django, you will fall asleep." Zoro looked at him impassively. "Of course I will," he said as he walked towards him. 1, 2, Django," he yelled triumphantly. Zoro lifted up his sword and slashed down Django's midsection. Blood stained his clothes, and he fell back onto the ground. How he managed before slipping under. "I closed my eyes," Zoro said blandly. "It's not hard." Meanwhile, Kuro was struggling to rein in his temper. He was the only black cat pirate left standing, and he didn't even consider himself a pirate anymore. Useless, a lot of them. If you wanted something done, he thought as he adjusted his glasses with his palm, so as to not cut himself with the 5 katana attached to his fingers, you did it yourself. He was about to make his move when a voice called out to him, "Clahatter." He turned to face Kaya, who looked like she'd been crying, which made sense. She'd probably woken up and found Mary in a bloody heap on the floor of the mansion. What surprised him was the gun she was pointing at him. "Please leave this village. I'll give you the sum of my wealth, but you can't hurt anyone. You must leave in peace," she said firmly. "Kaya, what are you doing here?" "Run or he'll kill you," Yusuf shouted. Kuro stared at her for a few seconds. Then he broke out laughing. Kaya's eyes widened. "Sorry, Miss Kaya, but this isn't just about the money. I had plenty of it back when I was Captain Kuro." His eyes hardened as he relived the memories. "What I couldn't stand was the lifestyle. The Marines constantly attacked my ship. Bounty hunters followed me wherever I went. It all got so annoying. What I want is a peaceful life. The villagers trust me. I have a good standing within the village. All I need now," a feral grin broke out across his face as Kaya looked at him in horror, "is for you to die so I can inherit your wealth." He walked up to Kaya, who despite what she was hearing, couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. Images of her time spent with the caretaker replayed in her mind, and her hands trembled. Kuro reached her and swept the gun from them. "And you will write that will." "I don't care what I have to do," he said quietly, reaching for her face with his long claws. Tears welled up in Kaya's eyes. This couldn't be Clahatter. How could it be? A shift in the air made Kuro freeze, and he swiftly turned around and blocked an oncoming pellet with his claws, swatting it away. "What a coincidence, Yusuf," he said menacingly as he lunged towards the sniper. "I still owe you for that punch you gave me." Yusuf got another pellet ready, but Kuro was too close already. He wouldn't make it. A fist collided with Kuro's face before he got within range. The impact sent him sailing through the air until he collided with the rock wall and fell to the ground. "Now you owe us double," Luffy said with a cocky grin. Kuro struggled to get up as he fought off the first signs of a concussion. He glared furiously at Luffy. "A devil fruit eater. I wasn't planning on killing anyone myself today, but it looks like there are plenty of volunteers." He bent over and started swinging back and forth. "Shikushi," he whispered, before vanishing from sight. At least that's what happened from the point of view of Yusuf, Nami, and Kaya. Luffy and Zoro looked on in apathy as he appeared to run around slashing random objects in slow motion. Should they do something, he wasn't even attacking them. Kuro was moving at around the speed of a novice sword user, but he didn't have the reaction speed to keep up with his own movements, and was suffering from severe tunnel vision. Luffy guessed that he was just attacking anything his eyes could perceive. It would work, in theory, against most East Blue enemies. If they couldn't keep track of his movements, they'd eventually be taken down. It would be more effective against a crowd of enemies, though, and Luffy didn't really have the temperament to wait for Kuro to find them. So he leapt forward, grabbing Kuro right out of his attack, and threw him. He collapsed on the ground, and growled in frustration before picking himself up. "You know," Luffy began. "You suck as a fighter, but as a pirate you fail miserably." "Neither of those things bother me," Kuro responded. "I am no longer a pirate, and after this, I will never have to fight again." Luffy shook his head. "That's just the thing. You look down at the life of a pirate, but the fact remains that you couldn't handle it. You ran away with your tail between your legs." Kuro's eyes narrowed. He didn't like what this kid was implying. He wanted a life of peace, but a coward he was not. Luffy smiled, knowing he had struck a nerve. Your will is weak, Luffy continued. Yusuf's ambition is much greater than yours. This time Kuro scowled fiercely. What kind of joke is this? You're comparing me to that pretend pirate. Luffy shook his head. Did you even hear me? Like I said, you can't compare to him. You're nothing, just a butler with a get-rich-quick scheme. There's no one in my crew whose ambition doesn't shit all over yours. Kuro was really getting frustrated now. Enough. Just how am I inferior to that play pretend pirate? Fame. Power. Intellect. Tell me. And don't give me that willpower bullshit. Foolish ambitions will get you nowhere in this world. Luffy's grin grew positively bestial. Would you like to test that out, then? Let's see who will get farther between you and my crew members. Luffy raised one hand to his straw hat and let loose the most powerful blast of Conqueror's Haki that he had used so far in this timeline. Kuro immediately fell to his hands and knees, his eyes widened to epic proportions. He looked up at Luffy with an infuriated and terrified glare. He gritted his teeth and sweat poured down his face as he tried to fight off the darkness that was claiming him, but after a few seconds he gave in, and his head fell to the ground with a thud. Zoro felt the pressure from the blast on his psyche, and raised an eyebrow as he brushed off its effects. Why had Luffy even bothered aiming it at him? Had he just decided to bombard the entire area? His eyes widened slightly at the thought, and he turned toward Nami and Usopp. They were both kneeling on the ground, eyes open but unfocused. Beads of sweat trailed down their faces, and their jaws were clenched, as if they were fighting off some unknown foe. After about 10 seconds they both recovered, panting for breath, and looking around frantically. Luffy looked a little guilty as he looked back at them proudly. Zoro snuck a glance at Kaya. She had been unaffected, wondering what was going on with everyone. At least Luffy had left her out of it. Zoro didn't think a whiff of the king's disposition would help her condition. Zoro speculated briefly about what Luffy's motive was. The obvious answer was that he wanted to expose them to the effects of the king's will. Fighting off its effects naturally strengthens one's willpower if done successfully. It was like exercising a muscle. The next time Nami and Usopp encountered a blast of that magnitude, they would have a significantly easier time with it. But why so early? Zoro was confident that Luffy was the only awakened conqueror in East Blue. Even in Paradise they were scarce. It wasn't until one sailed the New World that the power became somewhat common, and resistance to it became a must. Was Luffy just getting a head start with their crewmates? That was assuming, of course, that Luffy wasn't just trying to prove a point. He'd always had a lot of faith in his comrades. What should we do with the Black Cat pirates? They'll just wreak havoc when they wake up, he said as Luffy woke by. They wouldn't be waking up for a while, Luffy replied. The Marines will be here before they do. Zoro nodded. If Luffy had aimed his Haki at the entire area, then it wasn't just Kuro that would be out for a while. Nami and Usopp had fully recovered and walked over. What the hell was it just now? I felt like death was looming over me, Nami said shakily. Usopp voiced his agreement. Sorry. That was me, Luffy replied. Nami rounded on him, infuriated. What the hell do you mean it was you? What the hell did you even do? And whatever the hell you did, why the hell did you do it to us? She yelled with her fist raised. Aw, come on Nami, it was just to prepare you. And it builds character, he said cheerfully. You still haven't told us what it was, Usopp said curiously. Luffy thought for a moment as if having an inner debate with himself. Hey, what the hell, he thought. It's called Conqueror's Haki. 1 in a million people in the world are born with it. It allows you to forcefully overpower the minds of those with weak wills. Traits like self-confidence and mental discipline help one resist it, but the most important factor is willpower. A person with an unbendable will won't even bat an eye in the face of the most powerful conqueror. Not doubting. That is true power. Nami and Usopp took in the explanation with thoughtful expressions, and then they both nodded. Who knew that such a thing existed? The world truly was vast. That afternoon, after Mary had been bandaged up and briefed on the situation, he and Kaya told Luffy, Zoro, and Nami to meet them on the south shore. When they arrived, Nami's eyes filled with glee. Anchored near the coast was a white caravel that strongly resembled a goat. It's called the Going Merry, Mary said. It's an older model, but it should be helpful to you. Consider it a thank you gift. Nami agreed wholeheartedly. It was still a relatively small ship, but it was much more spacious than what they'd been using up until now. Luffy and Zoro stared at the ship for a little while. Memories flashed through their mind. Some happy, some painful, but all meaningful. After a while Luffy just looked at Mary and Kaya. Thank you, he said quietly. Usopp was looking at the ship fondly as Luffy, Zoro, and Nami boarded, but he also looked a bit uncomfortable. He looked from Luffy to the ship and back to Luffy. He began awkwardly. I was wondering if your offer to join your crew was still in effect. Luffy looked at him confusedly. Huh? Was all he said. Usopp looked down. Well, it's okay if it's not. I'm sure we'll meet on the sea someday, he said. What are you talking about? Luffy asked, confused. You already joined, remember? Now get on. Usopp's eyes whitened before a wide grin spread across his face. I'm the captain. He shouted, jumping into the air with his fist raised. Not a chance, Luffy said as Usopp climbed aboard. But if you want you can be second in command when Zoro's hungover. I don't get hungover. Zoro sputtered indignantly. Luffy smirked. You might as well. With the way you sleep, there would be no difference. Zoro scowled. Why do people with low tolerances always try to make up for it by talking shit? Luffy's smirk grew wider. You speak as if those swords don't compensate for anything. It took all of a second for that to sink in, before the two were full out brawling on the deck of their new ship. It lasted for a full 2 minutes before Nami and Usopp decided to risk their well-being to pull them apart. They had to set sail at some point. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.